debating right now what new normal looks like in your outfits. If I surveyed the American people in corporate America and asked about their productivity, and they said we're as productive or more productive from home, you got to keep that in consideration. But at the same time, if we've lost some collective productivity, and oh, by the way, we're humans and we like the human connection, what do you think the answer is in terms of moving towards some kind of new normal? I have CEOs who say, screw it, I just want it to be the way it used to be. As soon as this is over with, everybody comes back to work. I have some CEOs who say, no, we're kind of liking this working from home, so I'm going to abandon my headquarters. And for all points future, we're just going to be working from home. Both those are extremes. I don't think either one will work. But an answer is a hybrid model somewhere in the middle. What happens if you're the CEO, in your industry particularly, the healthcare industry, who says, screw it, everybody come back to work? What do you think happens? People vote with their feet. Because they don't have to put up with that. They just don't have to put up with that. They got lots of options out there. As a leader during a crisis, and other times as well, you got to be demanding, but not demeaning. If you want your organizations to improve, all the health plans to improve, all the collaboration between you all improve, you got to be demanding, but not demeaning. Which means you always got to raise the high bar. Throughout my career, both in corporate America now and the military, people would say, well, Lynch is never satisfied. And I took that as a compliment, not as a criticism, right? Because I was never satisfied. It was never good enough. What else can we do? The problem is, in some cases, leaders say, okay, let's do more, but they don't provide the resources to make that happen. I was taught as a general officer, vision without resources is hallucination. Vision without resources is hallucination. So if you tell your people, cool, man, let's do this, but you don't provide them the resources, people, time, and money to do it, it's just not going to happen. But that doesn't mean you ought not be demanding. You ought to always be raising the high bar. Talk about me. To celebrate diversity. I mean, the organizations, from my study, preparing for this, look to be diverse organizations. And that's wonderful. And when I say celebrate diversity, I'm not talking about race, creed, color, gender, that kind of stuff, even though I acknowledge that's important. I'm talking about diversity of thought. Diversity of thought. If you're a leader, and you all are, if you're a leader, you ought to surround yourself by people not like you. You ought to seek out contrarians. You ought to look for people who have different views of things than you do. And you ought to solicit them. So you got to ask yourself when you look in the mirror tonight, have you surrounded yourself by people not like you? Or did you take the easy way out? What I see all the time is I go into a C-suite, and I didn't see this on your board yesterday, so congratulations on that. I go into a C-suite and I see everybody looks just like the CEO. Because he just hired a bunch of people just like him because it's easier that way, right? Everybody agrees, let's do that, that's easy. But that's not what you want to do. You want to have some conflict. Strategic leaders have to embrace conflict. You have to have opportunities for people to voice their different opinions. So I'm going to give you some tips on how to be a better time manager during this crisis situation we're currently in. And I use this to talk about the folks who have burnout. Who here, I won't ask you to raise your hand, but some of you have reached burnout. After 18 months of working from home, trying to do the best you can, you've reached burnout. And generally, as I examine this, it's that person who in the morning turned on their computer and kept their computer on all day long until they went to bed in the evening, and they always made themselves available. And oh, by the way, there were a lot of meetings called during the pandemic from lonely people. I'm convinced that folks called meetings just because they were lonely and they wanted to get you all included in their loneliness so you can have a meeting together. And corporate executives, candidly, have a problem with saying no. Folks don't want to say a no to a meeting invite because they don't want to appear not to be a team member. And oh, by the way, they don't want to miss something. So I have clients that I've worked with that are burnt out because they woke up, turned on a computer, stayed on the computer all day long, went to bed, turned the computer off, went back, did it again the next day. And that's atrocious, it really is. So what I try to advocate during the pandemic, working from home or not, is you got to have boundaries. You got to have times where you say, I'm available, and then you got to have times where you say, I'm not available, and you got to stick by them. So I'm going to give you some techniques here. How many hours are there in a day? 24. I mean, we're all intelligent people, so no one wants to argue that number with me. There are 7 days in a week, 24 hours in a day. I'm just going to talk about the work week, Monday to Friday. Because I'm hoping, just like my soldiers in 3 Corps, you're protecting the weekend with your family. I'm hoping that's what you do. Because I guarantee on your deathbed, you're not going to wish you worked harder. I guarantee you're going to wish you spent more time with your family. So if you got 24 hours in a day, you break that down into 3 groupings, 15, 7, and 2. That's 24 hours. I argue that you got to get 7 hours of effective sleep every night. I argue you ought to spend 2 hours a day on your own health and well-being, fitness. And in my book and in all my speeches, I talk about resiliency. And oh, by the way, if you want to get through difficult times, you have to be resilient. You have to be physically resilient, spiritually resilient, emotionally resilient, societal resilient, familiar resilient. You got to be having all those things in place, because when bad times happen, it's not if they happen, but when they happen, you'll be prepared to respond. So I argue you ought to spend 2 hours every day focus on your fitness, physical fitness, spiritual fitness. That gives you 15 hours a day. You can't argue the point. Okay, now I still got 15 hours. Even if I work 10 hours a day, I still got 5 hours a day to do whatever the hell I want to do. You can't argue the point. You know, Sarah and I have this basic algorithm that we have since we transitioned military of 30, 30, and 40. 30% of the time we do this, make money. 30% is pro bono work with all the nonprofits we deal with. And then 40% is doing what the heck we want to do. So if you're working 10 hours a day, you still got 5 hours a day to do what you want to do. Spend time with family, spend time with friends. Are you doing that right now? Are you taking maximum use of that 5 hours a day that you have to do something else? I mean, that's the period of time where you ought not be doing computer work. You ought to be shutting off your computer. You ought to be setting boundaries. You ought to be telling your folks, I'm not available during this time. Are you doing that? The answer is no. And I know why. And again, look in the mirror and ask yourself how you're doing. And then the last thing I emphasize is always ask yourself how you live in your dash. When Sarah and I do these leadership tours, we've done 18 leadership tours, but I end every event at a cemetery. And I stand next to a tombstone at the cemetery. And I remind people that on the tombstone, there's always the name of the person that's buried there, and there's always a start date and an end date. And we're all going to die at some point in time. And oh, by the way, your name's going to be on some tombstone somewhere or some level of remembrance, and your start date is the day you were born. And the end date is the day you're going to die, and it may be tomorrow. Or God willing, it may be 40 years from tomorrow. You don't know, but you got to be prepared for that, which means you got to focus on what's between the start date and the end date. What is that? So how are you living your dash? That's what you ought to ask yourself every night when you look in the mirror. Are you truly focused on being a selfless servant? Are you truly focused on the greater good? Are you truly focused on being the best husband, the best father, the best corporate colleague that you can be? So when it's all said and done, by God, you can say, I did the best I could. I lived my dash, and I'm proud of what I did. And it's not about making a lot of money. Like you say, you never see a U-Haul trailer behind a hearse. Ain't nobody taking their money with them, right? Oh, by the way, though, when you are on your deathbed, you're going to say, man, I wish I had spent more time with my family. So I leave you with that. Always think about how you live your day.